hear more about your excellent ideas. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. I better put you on commission, I think. So the title of this segment now is about health. I'll just finish the fourth. I didn't deal with the fourth ecosystem, which is biodiversity. So I'll deal with that quickly because it's all to do with health as well. And then I'll get onto some of the modern human health issues, hopefully not cause too much indigestion after lunch. So the fourth of those 5 ecosystem functions, the fourth one I call it biodiversity, or ecologists call it dynamic ecosystem communities. But it's all about having predatory insects and pests and plant diversity, shrubs, the whole thing sort of networking, and that's what gives you the resilience and healthy environment. I'll just give you a couple of examples of how people have put this to benefit. The leaders in Australian agro, if not world agroforestry, are a group just west of Melbourne in the Otway Ranges called the Otway Agroforestry Group. You can see this is the Stewart family. So that photo on the left, that strainer post, and that photo is the same strainer post, by the way, as the marker. And trying to look at the year, 1994, so about 24 years ago, their place went down from about 90% forest and mixed forest vegetation down to 2%. So they're getting erosion, they were getting salt, they were getting rabbits. The whole thing was going wrong. Lambing percentages were dropping, no shelter. So they set about getting back to 20% or a bit more of revegetation with the original local species. At the end of that, 24 years later, despite taking 20% out of production to go into forest, their overall turnover, because of shelter and biodiversity health and stuff, went up 25 to 30%. And on top of that, they pushed in another 6 or 7 enterprises, from bush tucker to cut flowers to obviously timber products, because they're very professional about thinning and managing, and the salts disappeared, etc. So pretty much living proof of the value of biodiversity back into those sort of systems. And just one small example I did. On the left, they had a dam that was eroding with a lot of salt. They said, oh, what the hell, we'll put a fence around 3 or 4 acres, and they're in the sort of climate they can grow a lot of beautiful flowers, Australian natives. And you can see the result on the right. That's now one of their 7 enterprises. His wife now sells at high value these flowers into some of the leading restaurants down on what's called the Surf Coast, where they have Bells Beach and a lot of those places, a lot of tourism. So there's many advantages in fostering health in the ecosystem. I was privileged to work with probably the world's leader in vertical grazing layer and landscapes, Professor Fred Provenza out at Utah State. He's retired, but it was him that put a lot of us onto the fact that as graziers we tend to think horizontally, but there is a vertical grazing layer that the animals are co-evolved to use, and that layer has tens of thousands of phytonutrients or secondary nutrients in it, which the animals still have that animal wisdom from when they evolved in Africa to smell out if they're missing, say, a key mineral, or if they've got an intestinal worm burden. They'll go and chew on an Australian wattle with tannins, which tends to knock out have an anthelmintic approach. So. And on top of that, I don't have to tell you guys, we can't grow leukemia at home with our -12s and stuff, but tree lucerne, Tagesasti, 23% protein legume, and saltbush. So that it's another component to increasing diversity in the landscape. And of course, what they're calling silvopastoral systems, in other words, grazing systems under food trees, is something that is one of the best ways to fix carbon. And the oak landscapes in Spain and Portugal, high protein acorns, etc., shade, we're going into increasing climate change by the look of it. We've got enough attacks from some of the extremists in the cities and elsewhere, not just about food, but about animal welfare and I think shade. We've got treeless basalt country at home. We're trying to address this at the moment, so that's another issue. Just before I get on to human health, I'll very quickly deal with, as I started off earlier, about how our extraordinary planet is sustained by these 9 self-organising systems. And I'll stick my neck out, and I'll show you in a minute. The people who have the best solution to things like climate and water are us, we farmers on landscapes. And so this guy, Paul Hawken, who wrote this book, Drawdown, he's been probably in the last 30 years one of the leading thinkers in social and environmental change across the world. And about 15 years ago, he got sick of asking the climate scientists, so what do we do about it? And they said, oh, we don't know, we're just crunching the numbers. So he commissioned 70 leading scientists and analysts and said, let's get a list of the 100 best ways of pulling back down carbon dioxide or stopping it going up, and nitrous oxide and stuff like that. And so the result is this book, and they've fully costed 80 methods. And I've got to know Paul and working with him, and I said, when I looked at the book, I said there's 7 or 8 regenerative agriculture methods in there, grazing and agroforestry and a few things. I said they're all doing the same thing. Let's call them regenerative agriculture and look at the numbers. And the numbers show that by nearly 2.5 times better than the next method, regenerative agriculture is #1 by a country mile in addressing the issue of climate without the water and all the other stuff. So to me, that shows the potential that we have as farmers to really play huge and exciting roles. So that brings me to the human health issue, which I think is a biggie. And as you can see, those rats are discovering they're not in the best position, which a lot of us on Earth are starting to find as well. And I would argue that the same issues that have got us into damaging the planet's systems, it's intimately tied with why human health, post the Second World War with that great acceleration, one of the great accelerations, it's not on those graphs, it should be, is the alarming takeoff of modern human health diseases, mental and physical. So just quickly, we co-evolved in the African savannas for about 1 million years, the early hominids. That meant the women went off gathering. Most Indigenous women can identify 500 medicinal food plants. Men went off hunting, but they weren't just hunting meat. They were hunting animals that were browsers as well as grazers. So those animals were adapted to having tens of thousands of those phytonutrients in the landscape. And us, like them, have got receptors in our body, alimentary canal, organs, heart, feeding message, and the gut feeding message back to the brain if we're short on nutrients or whatever. Anyone who's watched their wife in late pregnancy will know about cravings, and it's not an excuse to have a dose of oysters or something. It's a genuine ancient recognition that they're lacking a nutrient. And we ignore this at our peril, because what industrial agriculture doing is stripping out most of the nutrients that a healthy soil delivers us, with big consequences. And I just mentioned before the tens of thousands new nutrients. That's just some examples that we now know in the vertical shrub layer. And remember, that layer doesn't get a worm burden from sheep or cattle on it either. You know, more than 8,000 phenolics, 25,000 terpenes, alkaloids. We just don't know what's out there because no one's looked until Fred Provenza started to look. So more reason for these diverse landscapes that you guys have been talking about it. And this is why I don't want to cause indigestion, because I think a lot of us still have to use a bit of glyphosate for weeds and the odd treatment. But there is no doubt now, the evidence is just overwhelming, that industrial agriculture destroys that diversity of nutrients coming into our food because we're killing off the soil biology, but with fertilisers and poisons. So that might be another view of human evolution. You can probably recognise the milkshake container, and I won't name the brand, but it's probably more sad than funny, that graph, because that's where we're going at the moment. There's a lot of research, and I'm only going to show a couple of slides of analysis of foods pre-Second World War, pre-First World War. And then what we've done with the modern food processors, if you want to store white goods, you've got to strip the hell out of your foods so they'll sit on a shelf for a year, but especially what we're doing to the soil. And surprise, surprise, nutrients are crashing across the board. You know, copper, calcium, magnesium, manganese, selenium, all the things critical for function, cell function, immune function. Lots of papers now, lots of big studies. That last one was the Ministry of Agriculture in the UK. Vegetables, this is for meat, and same with the other dairy, all the similar major food categories. Nutrients have crashed by up to 90% in some cases across the spectrum as we've shifted into an industrial as opposed to a natural food system with big health consequences. And one example here of 63 wheat cultivars, the modern white wheats, the bread wheats. Yeah, they're bred for dwarfed and sort of single-focused and responsiveness to irrigation and industrial input, but the nutrients have crashed out of sight. Copper, magnesium, manganese, iron, phosphorus, selenium, zinc, all crashing. So there's a cost in us pushing outside a natural boundary. And the same's happening in horticulture and veggies right across the board. And you know, dozens of papers now coming up. So it's irrefutable. And most of this decline, I mean, okay, a bit of food processing and what the supermarkets and that do, but most of it's related to that soil health issue, those mycorrhizal fungi and all the other bugs that go off and source all the nutrients. You shut them down, you end up with those drug addict plants really getting man-made inputs, not much more. And so this guy, Hippocrates, who gave us the modern medical ethics, allegedly 2,500 years ago said, "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." It's a profound truth in that. And so let's look at the elephant in the room, which is glyphosate, or aka Roundup. I've been looking at it, and I've spoken to some of the leaders, you know, your Don Hubers and other leading soil scientists in the States, a lot of physiologists, a lot of medical people. Some of them have reviewed 300-400 papers and starting to ring the bell very loudly. And we're up against some powerful companies, as you can imagine, who don't want the bell rung. But as of last week, we've just had the second big case against Bayer Monsanto that's been lost by them. So, you know, the evidence is mounting, and it's by no means the worst chemical, but it just happens to be the most widely used herbicide in the world, nearly 1 million tonnes going out across the world. Discovered in the 60s by a chemist in Switzerland, I think it was, who was fiddling around with chemicals to strip the rust out of the interior of galvanised pipes, and he found glyphosate. So it's called a chelator, which means it grabs whatever minerals it can, clumps them out. That's how it works. Its main function is chelation. So imagine when it gets into the soil, into our gut. When you spray a crop or a paddock and it goes yellow, it's because that chelation effect, the minerals have been taken out and the plants die and go yellow. So this guy, Bob Kramer, used to work for the United States Department of Ag. He started to ask hard questions and doesn't work there anymore, but I won't go through all the details, but he's been banging on about this. Really top scientist. Kills beneficial soil microbes and the ones that stop disease attackers. Binds up all the nutrients, discussed that. Makes the plants more vulnerable to disease because they haven't got all those resilient nutrients. Its breakdown products are more toxic than the primary chemical. Inhibits specific enzymes that detox outside poisonous elements, and so on and so on. Don Huber, I know he's done workshops up here in Queensland. I don't know if anyone's attended them. He's in his 80s now and just an outstanding scientist and deeply respected across the spectrum, the industrial as well as the regenerative. But I won't go through his list either, but there's just so much evidence out there by leading scientists who are prepared to look outside the system. And this is some of the stuff Huber's talking about: nutrient deficiency, you're getting high levels of toxic products, animals that eat plants and crops treated too much with glyphosate have a huge range of problems they're finding in the States, and so on. And I'd summarise it by saying there's two key reasons why glyphosate's emerging as the worst and most pervasive chemical in our environment. And part of that's because it's the most widely used. The first one, it interferes in a vital amino acid production pathway, which I'll touch on in a minute. And the second one is that it's water soluble, and therefore it penetrates key linings in our body. And they're finding out in the prairies now, in the cropping zone, organic farmers are losing status because glyphosate's coming up, because it's being evaporated out of the Mississippi and coming over in rain. So it's pretty pervasive, being water soluble. Is it in our food and water? Yes. The testing now shows a large percentage of industrial food has traces of glyphosate. Because it's in our food and water, it's getting into our guts. Our gut microbiome, which, you know, that second brain, nearly as heavy as our own, this brain up here, with all these bugs that are too small to look at. And this is the Shikimate pathway, which is a key pathway, and the amino acids are the ones like enzymes, hormones, integral to an immune function. And it's chopping that pathway up, right at the towards the end of that process, rendering those key immune fighters, etc., in our gut defenceless. When this was first raised, the big chemical company said, "Oh no, that's not a problem. Humans don't have this pathway." What they omitted to say, and they knew, was that the microbiology does, and that's what was being knocked out in our gut. 5 minutes, okay. And so I'll quickly just summarise. So that's causing major issues in the gut, like leaky gut, because it's water soluble, crossing the gut lining, causing all sorts of issues. Crossing the vital blood-brain barrier, another critical defence mechanism, and other sensitive linings in our body, like the embryonic placental membranes even, and causing major genetic issues. And if you listen to this extraordinary scientist and doctor, Zach Bush, who started his work with, he noticed the acceleration in autism in America. And he's now connecting it very strongly to modern foods and the corrosion of the microbiology, etc. And he's found out that some of the key microorganisms involved in the soil are the same ones in the gut where some of the problems are occurring. And for example, in the States, I think in the 70s, there's one child in 400 and something with autism. Now it's 1 in 37. And we've got a similar pathway. And it's such a complex disease, I know, but it's clear linkages to the role of chemicals like glyphosate coming through the gut. We haven't got time to touch on this, but epigenetics, once upon a time it was thought that you could only have genetic change through mutation of the DNA. We now know, and it came about through study of, in the Dutch hunger winter, we now know that you can have heritable change without the DNA being altered, it's just the genes being switched on and off through an environmental influence. And I touched on that earlier when I was talking about what's going on in our gut with healthy food, the switching on and off of genes. So what put them onto this was, in that period from late 1944 to 1945, there's a cohort of women who are pregnant in Holland who are severely starved. And by accident, they studied the first and second generations, the children and then the grandchildren, and they found that group of women compared to women that weren't starved had a huge increased rate of mental and physical diseases. And the only thing they could connect it to was that switching on and off of genes. And now, recently evidence is coming in that's going through to the grandchildren. So we stress genetics as the mechanism of evolution. without realising that our genes are constantly talking to our environment. If there's nasties in that environment, it's going to switch on and off genes. And so here we've got a squirrel on the psychiatrist's couch, and he's telling the psychiatrist, when I learned you are what you eat, I realised I was nuts. But it's not you are what you eat. It's therefore you are also what your mothers and grandmothers ate, which is sobering thinking when us as parents raising kids, etc. And moreover, while we might be what we eat, we're also what we don't eat. In other words, if you're eating junk food and you're not getting the really good stuff, that also has epigenetic consequences. So how do we turn this around? Well, I guess I preach an underground insurgency that through healthy food and fibre off regenerated landscapes, undoubtedly we can, by partnering with urban food communities and etc., we can have a huge influence on human health. And as I just showed with that drawdown stuff, of all people, it's we farmers that can play a huge role in addressing climate ills. And this is now rising in Australia. The whole Albany group in Western Australia has got a regional food process. There's guys like Food Connect in Brisbane. There's community-supported agriculture. There's local organic shops. It's growing. And the secret, of course, is this healthy soil food web, the soil mineral cycle. We kill that, we've got big problems. And the other issue, before I wrap it up, if you look at some disturbing studies around at the moment, 6-year-old children in Australia, one big study of 3,000 or 4,000, only 1 in 4 has ever climbed a tree or a rock. So we're divorcing ourselves from nature, and 10-year-old kids and under in Australia, surveys are showing that for every hour of outdoor play, 7 or 8 hours in front of the screen or on these devices. So big issues if we're going to reconnect with nature and drive what we're co-evolved for. So I'll wrap up both of my talks now. Seems a bit dramatic, but I firmly believe that we are on the edge, both health-wise, as this rocketing health explosion takes off. I mean, listen to some of the people in that field, they're saying just autism and obesity alone are going to be each $50 billion problems within decades, which will kill any economy. And the planet's getting into dangerous territory. But that's not... I don't want to make us all depressed because I'm really positive about the solutions. But it's the old saying, today's problems aren't going to be solved with today's mind. Or as one Bushy said to me the other day, the thinking that got us in this shit won't get us out of it. So we do have to change that square foot of real estate, that paradigm change business if we're going to shift to this new situation. And one of America's leading environmental historians, Donald Worcester, has laid down 3 pretty good principles for good farming, I would have thought. Making people healthier, promoting a just society, and preserving the earth and its network of life. And good old Looning, of course, has captured it. We need to go back and incorporate that attitude that Indigenous people and even the medieval peasants had, where they never saw themselves as separate from Mother Earth, but whatever you did to Earth, you did to yourselves. We need to combine that mind, the organic mind, with the best of the mechanical, the best of science, not have one of them dominate, as is occurring at the moment. And so I'll give you this new law to think about, the law of the turtle. Behold the turtle, he makes progress only when he sticks his neck out. And so, to wrap it up, I can see through regenerative agriculture 3 major profound solutions for our challenging times. Of anyone, we have the key solutions to the Anthropocene crisis. We have an agriculture that heals, we have an occupation and a practice that heals natural systems, and we have some of the best solutions to this escalating health crisis. So the last thought I'll leave you with, ushered by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who Hitler had deliberately executed the day before the second last day of the war. he says that the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world it leaves to its children. And we've seen a couple of kids perform today who epitomise the future in a great way. So I'll leave that sentiment with us. And we've got time for questions or move on from there. So I'll leave it there, I think. Thank you.
Very moving. We do have 5 minutes for questioning.
Sure.
So, yeah.
No hard ones.
Yeah. You know, is there anything on the... yes, Deb McLucas, thank you.
You know, thank you. in our future as we see it now.
Well, it's part of the same problem. There's no way they think they can mimic complex Mother Nature sourcing thousands of nutrients. And the same goes for hydroponics. That's now being pushed by some of the industrial end as the big solution. Again, it's just a man-human control thing. There's no way you can replicate what that extraordinary biology is doing for food. So, you know, we're going to be increasingly under attack. We are already from extremist animal, you know, vegans and others. But I think we have such a good story to tell that it's just a matter of us getting out and telling it. But, yeah, no, there's pitfalls that they're emerging. We just need to shoot them down for how flawed they are. There's one there, I think.
I might start here first.
Sorry, mine's a bit too practical perhaps. It's about glyphosate and rat's tail. Given all that information about glyphosate, I'm ready to just, I don't know, abandon it altogether, but I still have to do something about my rat's tail.
Look, we're dealing with a couple of really aggressive perennial weed species, even with full ground cover at home. And at the moment, I'm just trialling a new registered organic spray, so I'm going to see what happens there. But we're putting sort of humate additives with the glyphosate to hopefully modify the worst of its effects. You can buy drums of that sort of humate additives for chemicals. Yeah, because it is a catch-22. You can manage your countries to full ground cover and health and remnant seed from... and we've got neighbours wall-to-wall with lovegrass. It's making life a bit hard. So, yeah, I'm not saying it's an easy solution. But it looks like there are some promising organic herbicides just coming on the market that have been registered in Australia. It looks like Monsanto and company have blocked the registration for the time being in the States.
And we're going to talk about that question a bit more later on during the Q&A weed panel. We've got a few different point of views, and I'm sure together we can come up with some solutions. I know you are keen on a question, but I'd quickly just like to pass over to Jim.
Thanks very much, Juliana. This one's a little out of left field, I suppose, Charles, but it's one of the things that I sort of try and grapple with. One of the underlying themes that we've talked about is in capacity.
Some uncomfortable stuff happening because, just give you one example, I've got a brother-in-law who works in a strategic think tank in Canberra, and he slipped me a paper the other day that he'd vetted a little bit in confidence, but China is already damming the Mekong and the Brahmaputra rivers upstream of an area where about a third of the human population exists. They're already playing the water wars now. And at the same time as with climate change, the Himalayan glaciers are shrinking and there's 5 of the world's big rivers come off it. So, you know, draw your own conclusions, but there's going to be some uncomfortable stuff. And that's what usually happens when animal populations get too big. I don't think there's any way we can dodge it. Yeah, maybe I'm being too biological on my, or ecological on my assumption, but you can't dodge it, I don't think.